Hi everyone, Dreki here, and today I'm comparing the SJCam SJ8 Pro with the Akaso V50x. Both of these cameras film stabilized real 4K at 30 frames per second, but one of them costs twice as much. So we'll see if these cameras are any good, put them side by side, compare features, that sort of thing, and talk about if it's worth spending twice as much on the SJ8 Pro. On to you, Studio Dreki.
So that was quite the transition. Side by side, there are a few differences between these two cameras. The V50x is smaller and has more buttons, while the SJ8 Pro is a little bit larger, which means larger screen, and the plastic it's made from feels better in the hands. The build quality on the V50x is still pretty good, mind you, just that if I were to blindly hold the two, I would immediately think the SJ8 Pro is the more premium device. The other thing you might notice is that the V50x has a broken screen here. While I was out filming last night, I dropped the camera rig I film with and both cameras crashed into the ground. Fortunately, the SJ8 was spared. As you can see, there's this little lip of plastic around the lens that protects it if the camera were to fall forward. The V50x on the other hand doesn't have that, so now there's a chip in the lens and the screen is cracked, which absolutely sucks. So I guess we're going to test over the next couple weeks the availability of parts on the Akaso V50x, because a screen replacement and a lens replacement shouldn't be too hard. Anyways, moving on to the rest of the camera body, the SJ8 lacks buttons and that's a bit of a downside. On the V50x, I often found myself using a combination of buttons and the touch screen to change settings, whichever was more convenient. While the SJ8 Pro, it's more or less touch only. While that's fine for using the camera outside of the waterproof case, once you put it in the waterproof case, you better hope that you've got your settings right, because you won't be able to change much. I also found the SJ8 Pro's user interface a little bit more confusing. It's got these submenus that have small text that's kind of hard to read, whereas the V50x it's all this big, bright, and easy to see text. It's not that the SJ8 Pro's user interface is really all that bad, it's just the V50x is so much easier to understand. When it comes to specification, that V50x is based on a high silicon chipset, something decidedly mid-ranged. This does stabilized 4K at 30 frames per second, which is its highest resolution. The SJ8 Pro, on the other hand, it's based on a mid to high-end Ambarella chip, similar to what is used in several premium cameras such as the GoPros. This enables 4K 30 with image stabilization, as well as true 4K 60, although that does not have image stabilization. If you want high resolution and high frame rate, really the only way to go between these two cameras is the SJ8 Pro. Its 1080p 60 is also better, but we'll get to that in a moment. To add to that, it's also worth noting that the SJ8 Pro can use both distortion correction and image stabilization at the same time, while on the V50x it's only one or the other. So all these previous clips have been stabilized 4K at 30 frames per second from both cameras. I think that it's the best resolution both of these cameras film in. The SJ8 Pro, it's notably wider angle and more distorted than the V50x, but as I mentioned earlier, you can turn on distortion correction. That being said, despite the distortion, that SJ8 Pro just has a little bit more fine detail in things like grass and leaves. Here are some close-up resolution comparisons. I know how hard it can be to tell the difference between 4K on one camera and another camera on a small screen like a phone, so I'm going to zoom real nice and close here and just go through a couple stills so you can see the difference. Look for things like leaves, power lines, and that's where you'll really see where one camera has better resolution than the other. Honestly though, if you plan on filming at 4K 30 frames per second and detail is your priority, there's really no right or wrong choice, merely a visual preference. If you prefer more of a finished video product, the V50x is the way to go because it has more contrast and bright punchy colors. On the other hand, the SJ8 Pro is a little bit more neutral, even in its vivid mode, and that means you have more leeway in post-production to edit the colors, pull up that contrast a little bit, change the brightness, and still get some detail in those highlights. The one place the V50x beats the SJ8 Pro is image stabilization, at least for straight-on filming. The reason the V50x has a more narrow field of view, it's not just because of its lens, but because the image stabilization crops in a lot more and is significantly more aggressive. You'll notice it as I'm riding along here. The SJ8 Pro has a little bit more bouncing and bumping, whereas the V50x is more or less remarkably smooth. it would be the ideal camera for walking with, whereas I think the SJ8 Pro is a little bit better in some hard action scenes because it isn't as aggressive and doesn't try and hold the frame in the center, which means when you're turning corners, it's very smooth. The V50X, it tends to stutter a little bit. In this clip where I'm riding here with the cameras mounted to my helmet, I know it's not the same clip, but it's a good comparison. You can see the SJ8 Pro, it struggles to keep up with all the shaking and the straight on stuff, but when I turn the corner, the camera knows what I'm doing and more or less keeps it smooth. The V50X, on the other hand, definitely prioritizes straight on stabilization. It's much smoother until I get to these corners where it freaks out for a half second, causing some juddering and skipping, and then goes back to being smooth once I'm going straight on again. It's less noticeable in your average use, but when you're biking or turning quickly in really any scene, it does make it look like the camera is dropping frames when you turn too quickly. When it comes to color balance, both of these cameras process the image in their own way. Sometimes, like in overcast lighting or sunny daylight, it's pretty close. The V50X tends to be a little bit more punchy with that vibrant bright color and high contrast, which means that you may actually prefer the way it looks in this side by side. On the other hand though, the SJCam is definitely more accurate in this scene. It makes things a little bit bright for my taste by default, so I always set it to -2/3 in EV. When it comes to mic quality, I'll let Out and About Dreckie take it from here.
Right now, the audio you're hearing is just from the headset that came with my Samsung phone. I figured that a headset like this would be something everyone has and serves for a good comparison of an external audio device versus the sound built into the cameras. When we switch over to the SJCam SJ8 Pro, you're probably going to immediately hear a lot of that wind. With the lapel mic, the wind is blocked by my shirt, by my body, but on the SJCam SJ8, the microphone is exposed and free, and for some reason this camera picks up a ton of wind. You'll hear it once we start rolling here, it is bad. The V50X, on the other hand, doesn't pick up as much wind, but I think there's a software filter removing it. And that's the thing, the software filter that removes the wind also removes your voice. So if you start rolling and riding and stuff, you're just not going to hear anything. And even now, sitting here where it's kind of windy, I have no confidence that the audio is going to pick me up whatsoever. So let's start rolling and see how that goes. So we'll start again with audio from the phone headset. You probably can't hear much in the way of wind or bumping or anything like that. You'll mostly hear my voice. When we switch over to the microphone built into the SJCam SJ8, it's probably not going to be too bad either. And when we switch over to audio from the SJCam SJ8 Pro, right now it's probably not going to be too bad either. I imagine you can hear more or less what I'm saying, maybe a little bit of wind noise and a little bit of vibration from the tire up through the handlebar where it's mounted. But once we turn the corner into the wind here, the audio is going to get bad. I'm warning you. Close your ears. I mean, it wouldn't be fair to switch over to the V50X now. Let's see how the V50X does in this situation, for example. And here we are on the Akaso V50x. I can't imagine you can hear me at all right now. And here we are on the Akaso V50x. I can't imagine you can hear me at all right now. This camera does not pick up much noise, especially when you are surrounded by wind. But let's turn the corner here, so we're going more with the wind instead of against it. And then my voice will probably become a little bit more clear. I imagine now you'll be able to hear me more or less. Not really hear much in the way of bumps or jolts or anything coming up from the handlebars, but the V50X, quite frankly, is not a very good microphone.
So one major difference there is that the SJ8 Pro has a setting for microphone gain in camera, which lets you select a higher or lower mic volume depending on what you're doing. For example, if you're at a large concert, you would select a lower volume so it doesn't get all fuzzy and crackle, but for general use, you'd leave it at like an 8 or a 9. The V50X is missing this setting, which is possibly one reason why the mic is always so quiet. Another notable issue with the V50X is microphone sync. At about the 2-minute mark, the audio and video slips out of sync a little bit, and if you plan on taking long videos while talking, this could definitely be an issue for you. Night and low light with these cameras, well, the SJ8 Pro is definitely a little bit better with less noise and more detail. A small side-by-side like this, it's going to be hard to tell again, but if we look up close, you might be able to see that the V50X pushes shadows a little bit darker and highlights a little bit brighter, and has a little bit more noise smoothing, but to be honest, they look pretty similar overall. That's quite remarkable for such an inexpensive camera. Most of these cheap cameras make night video look like garbage, but honestly the fact that it's this close to the SJ8 Pro is kind of mind-blowing. I recommend using a 30 frames per second mode and turning off the image stabilization at night. That way you'll get pretty usable night footage from both cameras, especially if you have a tripod or a table or somewhere else stable to place them. High frame rate modes such as 1080p 60 are the other weakness of the V50X. When the video is moving, compressed down onto a small size like this, especially if you're watching on a phone screen, they're still going to look very similar, so I'll take a freeze frame here and look up close. The difference is pretty crazy, honestly. If you took the 4K video of the V50X and compressed it down to 1080p, you get a much better quality than this, so the camera is definitely capable of doing better, but there's a firmware issue that makes it look like garbage. The video looks crunchy and blocky, and for example, looking at the right hand side of this freeze frame, you can see the power lines are not smooth, they're sharp and jagged. That same problem applies to the 2K60 on the V50X. Turning off image stabilization kind of helps, but what's the point of having image stabilization if you're not going to use it? When it comes to still photos between these two cameras, they're remarkably similar during the day. They're quite close in terms of levels of detail, and just like video, the V50X is just a little bit higher contrast. At night though, the SJ8 Pro really flaunts its prowess, with that higher quality sensor and better image processor working wonders. It has more detail in shadows and highlights, less noise, and the long exposure looks phenomenal compared to the V50X. The V50X pushes its images towards a higher ISO by default, which means more noise, but it also means it's a little bit easier to capture images that are not blurry than the SJ8 Pro. When the SJ8 Pro is held steady though, it is way better. And that brings me to my final point, the X versus Pro designation. The V50X, it's really just a simplified version of Akaso's higher end cameras, and it's very effective in making things easy to use for beginners. The quality is decent overall, especially at 4K, its user interface is extremely easy to understand. Unfortunately, because it's so simplified, it is missing a couple features such as the mic gain, Pro Tune color mode, bitrate settings, those sorts of things that you'd expect on a professional level camera. The SJ8 Pro, being a pro level camera, has all of these settings and more. So what camera should you buy between these two? Well, if you're getting your first action cam and you don't care about the mic quality, I think the V50X is a good choice. It has excellent stabilization, good build quality, and a low learning curve. Keep that camera in 4K mode and I think you'll be more than happy with the video it outputs. The SJ8 Pro, on the other hand, it has much more room to grow into. If you want a camera where you will get pretty consistent quality at any resolution, and it offers more ways to customize the video, mind you only using the touchscreen, I would go with the SJ8 Pro. I hope this helped cleared up some things about both these cameras. Maybe one day the V50X will have a firmware update that offers a microphone fix and a 1080p fix, but aside from those two issues, I'm surprised how good of a run for its money the V50X actually gave the SJ8 Pro. Links to see the prices of both the cameras are in the description. Thanks for watching.
Go, 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 go.